And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again with another YouTube reading guide series, and this one is with quite a bang. Today is the preface and introductory video to a 14 video series walking through the correct reading order of Superman by DC Comics. To create this reading guide, I have read the 1,677 issues that comprise the shared Superman continuity from 1991 till 2011, including the essential spin-offs, tie-ins, and events. And I've used that knowledge to build the internet's most detailed reading guide and reading maps for the world's most famous superhero. It's quite a big thing for me. I've spent quite a while working on and planning this in the background whilst the channel's been ticking over with a lot of Valiant stuff and random thoughts and all sorts of bits and pieces. This is probably the biggest reading guide I've done since DC New 52, and I think you'd be quite impressed with the increased quality and professionalism that it's going to start bringing to the channel. And that's going to be the case for a lot of future guides that are coming. This guide, specifically the Superman one, is actually not going to be a map per se. It's going to take the form of a Google sheet that I've split into 14 tabs, representing the 14 discrete eras I've split this period of Superman reading into. Now, this Google sheet can be viewed and downloaded for free from my website. Generally, each era or tab is separated by a major DC event that I will also be releasing a separate video on. What that means is that this playlist is going to continue every single Superman video, but interspersed throughout for the next 27 days, I'm also going to be releasing videos for every single DC event in chronological order. What that means is that ultimately there'll be two separate playlists of videos, and the next month means every single day there is going to be another major video dropping for this series or for the DC event series. If you're only interested in DC events, they'll have their own 11 video playlists that you'll be able to look at separately. And each of those 11 events have a dedicated reading map, which again will be available on the website, and we'll be using the new and upgraded software that I mentioned recently in one of my other videos. So let's cut to the chase. Why am I doing this? Well, I've always been a Superman fan. I've always been a Superman fan. He's one of my favorite superheroes of all time. In fact, out of the Trinity, I would argue he's probably my most sort of preferred or favorite superhero. He's just incredible. Another reason to do it is I have many of these issues. Physically, I have loads of them, or I have access to them. So it seemed like something that was worth doing. Another reason is that this seemed like a good way to warm up for the Rebirth guide. And yes, I am doing a guide for DC Rebirth, which I'm actually working on at the moment, and I've made a fair bit of progress on. And finally, the reason that I'm doing this is because there's a general consensus on the internet that this is incredibly confusing to read, that it's a very confusing era of comics for lots of reasons. And when I started diving into it, well, to be honest, I agree. This was hella confusing. So it's well worth putting together a reading order for it. That brings me to my next step, which is exactly what am I doing? Well, it's important to note that I'm not starting my reading order with issue 1 of Superman or Action Comics rather from 1939. I don't read retro comics, Golden Age, Silver Age, and so on. I should also point out it doesn't start with, for example, the first issue of Adventures of Superman, which came out in 1987, pretty much straight after the Crisis of Infinite Earths. I do know most people view the post-Crisis era to be modern DC comics, but for me, even for me, that's just too retro. It's not something where I'm into. So for me, my comic reading starts off with roundabout kind of Death of Superman, Nightfall, that kind of era of comics. What that means for DC is, especially with Superman, we're looking at kind of the Death of Superman era. Now, in this case, what I've decided to do is to start my reading from the comics in July 1991 with the very first issue of the ongoing series Man of Steel. That means that this reading guide is going to start with the following 4 series and the following 4 issues from those series. So Man of Steel issue 1 from July 1991, Superman issue 57, Adventures of Superman number 480, and Action Comics number 667. And yes, they all came out in July 1991. Now, this is a personal and subjective choice made by me. It was hard to get hold of earlier issues, and frankly, I find them unreadable. So this is about as early as I can stomach. In fact, this goes a little bit earlier than I'm comfortable reading with, because it took quite a few, well over 100 issues before I actually got to the death of Superman and more kind of contemporary reading. Now, of course, there are going to be people that watch the video and immediately start saying, well, I need to do a reading guide for the period before this, even if it's just from Christ on Infinite Earths and so on and so forth and so on. No, I'm not going to do that. This isn't a paid job. I do this for fun, and I wouldn't find reading that fun, so I'm not going to do that. Some people are going to argue that it means that therefore I don't know what's happening with Superman. I'm just starting in the middle of the story and so on. That's not really a fair criticism. The truth is, when it comes to comics, there is no perfect starting point. I often refer to myself as a type J reader rather than a type P reader, and I'd ask you to keep that in mind. So let's look at this. We have Man of Steel starting in July 1991. Now, at this time, there were 4 Superman series, all collected along their lines in unsatisfying trade paperback formats. The reason I say that is that you might collect, say, 6 issues of Action Comics, but they would make no sense, as these 4 series all had stories running across their 4-week cadence. In other words, there are 4 concurrent publications with constant crossovers. You might have something in week 1 in Man of Steel, continued in week 2 in Superman, continued in week 3 in Adventures of Superman, in week 4 in Action Comics, and then looping back again the next month, that story would continue in Man of Steel. So it was often difficult to read this in a trade paperback or normal collection format, and that's because of these explicit and implicit crossovers within these 4 lines. What that led to is what people refer to as the triangle era of shield numbering, also known as navigation numbers. You can see them here on the screen. And what happened was DC Editorial realized that they had such a confusing publishing schedule. What they started doing was putting in these little Superman shields on the cover of every issue the number it had. And then throughout the year, you had one numbered shield comic being released every week. So you'd have about 50 numbered Shield comics coming out in a year, and then the next year the numbers would reset. And so when in doubt, you could follow the triangle numbers. This is what people refer to when they talk about the triangle era of Superman. However, that's not very helpful, as I found out. I started to put together my reading order using the triangle numbers and discovered that there were occasional unnumbered spin-offs, unnumbered one-shots. Occasionally, the triangle numbers were errors. Occasionally, there were certain implicit crossovers that meant that you couldn't understand one issue without reading a very specific follow-on issue. Sometimes there were explicit crossovers, a similar thing, but explicit instead. In addition, a 5th series launched a few years in called Man of Tomorrow, which was a randomly published series. This wasn't published on a monthly cadence or anything like that. It was only published to fill in the gaps on the months that had 5 Wednesdays. I know it sounds random. We'll talk about it when we get to that in this series. There were also various mini-series that were in continuity, and there were also one-off crossover issues. Sometimes you needed to read an issue of Wonder Woman, or you needed to read an issue of Supergirl or Detective Comics, and those obviously weren't triangle numbered either. To make things even worse, some series were renamed but not renumbered. Some series were renumbered but not renamed. So this became really confusing and really complicated. When you add to that, there were line-wide and universe-wide events that could be split into 3 types of issues: essential issues, related issues, and token issues. That just made the whole reading experience even more complicated. Now, as part of this series, I will be doing separate reading maps for 11 major DC events. And whilst those videos are going to be released in a way that is interspersed with the Superman videos, they will also form their own DC events playlist on my channel, and they'll also have the individual maps separately available on my website. Now, the reading guide for the Superman issues will be slightly different. It won't be a pictorial map because that didn't feel like a helpful or useful way to share this information. So instead, as I said, I've gone through a Google Sheet with 14 tabs on it. The link's on the website, but it's not an editable link. So what you need to do is to download it if you want to use it yourself, or you can just view it online. Okay, admittedly, all that was quite confusing, and there are probably several terms in what I've just said that were new to you. That's okay. As part of the planning for this series and my future major series, I've done some very clear explanatory videos of all of these things that I've just talked about. Now, I won't force you to watch them here, but I will have them linked in the description. There's actually a playlist on my channel called Vocabulary of Comics, and I would very much recommend that you read the one about continuity, which talks about Type P and Type J readers, and also the one about comic terms and definitions, which talks about things like implicit arcs and explicit arcs and universe-wide events and so on. Let's have a look at the spreadsheet itself. So events that cross over are going to be clearly marked. It's going to be a case of, as this spreadsheet exists, just read the comic on the top line. Once you've read that, go down one line, read the comic on that row. And literally row by row, you should be able to see which comic to read next. And there's going to be a very clear reading order. For the majority of the issues, there's actually a little note, which means that if you hover over that particular issue number, it will tell you what the triangle number for that issue is, and any other commentary you might need, whether or not it's part of a larger story arc, whether or not it crosses over the particular event, and so on. It's worth noting that when it comes to annuals, I generally ignored the annuals within the Superman eras that we're talking about. And the reason for that is that the 90s was largely a time when DC used annuals in series like Superman, Adventure of Superman, Wonder Woman, and so on as part of annual wide events. Now, there is another playlist on my channel specifically talking through DC annual events and explains what they're about and how they work and so on. And again, that was a series I made specifically as a prelude to this one so that I wouldn't have to explain it in detail here and it would be as hopefully uncomplicated as possible. Spoilers. Well, I have to be honest, there are going to be some spoilers I can't avoid. And I'm going to say some literally now in the next 10 seconds. So if you don't want them, skip forward. But my point is, I can't avoid the fact that there's a story arc called The Death of Superman. And I can't avoid the fact that, for example, at one point Lex Luthor becomes president. If spoilers that are 20 or 30 years old are too much for you, then I'd recommend leaving the internet, but especially I'd recommend leaving my channel. I do my best to be very, very good about spoilers and avoid them as much as possible. In fact, a lot more than I think some of my viewers would prefer. But at the same time, sometimes it's unavoidable. An interesting note to keep in mind is that overall, this is a reading guide, not a reading order. What that means is that generally speaking, I'll be talking about how certain issues relate to other issues. So, for example, there'll be some points where I'll say something like, oh, before this issue, you needed to have read this other miniseries or something like that. I try to be as specific and clear as I can, but I guess to cut a long story short, what I'm saying is that please don't contact me asking me for more detail or more kind of linearity to the reading order here, because this is as linear and clear and continuous as is really possible, having read all 1677 issues. Um, and to have any much of a higher degree of precision here requires really kind of a type P mentality, which I just don't have. A quick caveat on the events here. The big DC events that I'll be covering over the next month are only the ones that intersect with Superman himself. In other words, as I was reading my Superman issues, occasionally I'd come along and find an issue and I go, oh, this has got branding that says this particular event. I guess I need to read that event. If I didn't come across any issue that specifically had branding for an event, that means that I missed it this time round. So, for example, I don't cover Final Crisis. At a later point, when I do reading guides for other DC characters, I've no doubt I will come across these other events that perhaps Superman wasn't involved in, and I will cover those and I will add those to my DC event playlist. It's also worth noting that I'm not covering Superboy here, or Supergirl, or anyone else superhero at all, basically. This is just Kal-El. This is just a Superman reading guide. I may well go back at some point and do a Superboy guide. I'm definitely going to do a Supergirl guide at some point, but right now we're just looking at Superman. It's worth giving a shout out here to the YouTube channel Name and Condition with Omar, who kind of does an amazing amount of work and does basically fantastic championing of the comic community on that channel. Now, he's put together a Superman reading order. This is an excellent guide and an overview to the Superman issues we're discussing in their currently collected format. So, trade paperbacks, omnibuses, things like that. Um, I won't be talking about the different sort of collections that are available here for two reasons. One, you can either find that on the Crushing Crisis website, which is an incredible website that has loads of information about collector's editions, or of course you can use Omar's video series. His video series, in fact, starts straight after Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it goes all the way up to, well, pretty much the modern day. Now, I don't really care about the post-Crisis of Infinite Earth era. As I said, I've arbitrarily decided to start at Man of Steel 1, which is what we'll be covering tomorrow in the first video in the series. And this guide is only going to go from 1991 to 2011. And the reason for that is that after 2011, you have the New 52, and I already have a New 52 guide on my channel. That's relevant up until 2016. And after 2016, we have DC Rebirth, and I am building a DC Rebirth guide at the moment. But that said, if Omar's got this video series, why does my guide exist? Well, the reason for it is because the way Superman is currently collected is a fucking bin fire. It's an absolute mess. I'll tell you this. I don't know if you've ever watched the Fast and Furious movies. Try watching them and take a shot every time someone says the word family. You'll be hammered halfway through the movie. Similarly, if you start watching any of Omar's videos about Superman and take a shot every single time he says that there is a gap of issues that are collected, or that the mapping in a particular collection is all over the place, you will be absolutely hammered about 20 minutes into these videos because the mapping is all over the place and there are so many gaps of collected issues. That said, I will be constantly name dropping and referring to his channel, and I'll have links for that in every single description for my Superman guide because I think it is a really great reference, and I know a lot of people prefer to exclusively read in collector's edition. That's a terrible idea, by the way, especially when it comes to reading Superman. It's going to be incredibly unfulfilling and very confusing, but if that's what you want to do, Omar's got you covered. And I'll have those videos, as I said, in the description. What I do want to mention is that for the first time, I'm going to make the entire written guide of all my notes and everything else available. Now, they're going to be available for purchase, not free download, which is something I'm doing kind of as a proof of concept idea. So the day this video goes up is also the day that I am self-publishing and releasing on Amazon for 99p the entire written guide we have here. This is about 140 A4 pages. Obviously, it's been formatted into a normal book size, so it's a couple of hundred pages at this point. And what this is a step-by-step breakdown of every single era and the 11 intersecting events. So that's all 14 Superman eras and the 11 DC events that intersect with Superman, and an intro and an afterword and just some stuff by me and a pretty simple but I think quite nice cover, as you can see here. And it's available for 99p or 99 cents in your area. I mean, I'm trying to make it as cheap as humanly possible. You do not have to buy this by any means. These videos are obviously on YouTube and they cover everything. The actual spreadsheet itself is available on my website as a free download. All the reading maps are available on my website for you to look at and peruse to your heart's content. This guide is simply a written version of all of that and doesn't contain anything extra or anything new. Maybe a little bit more in the intro and the afterwards, but honestly, don't worry about it. It's not compulsory. One helpful thing about the guide is that if over the next few months or next few years, I find out there's any errors in this guide, which I massively doubt, but you never know. We did find 7 errors in the new 52 guide and things like that. So if there are any errors here, I can just update it in the written guide and those patches will get rolled out to your Amazon Kindle. And so you'll have an updated guide all the time. This is a proof of concept. It's just something I'm trying. I don't specifically try to push people to buy these sorts of things. If you are in the mood to buy an Amazon book, then please do buy my own self-published prose novel, which is the one on the website. In fact, there's an excerpt on the website as well. So please check that out and please buy that and please review that because ultimately that counts much more to me in terms of supporting the channel than doing anything else. On that note, and finally, I have no doubt, under any circumstances, that the most common comment I'm going to get throughout this entire series, forever, will be people asking me when I'm doing a Batman reading order, or more likely, telling me to do a Batman reading order. Well, I'm not a big Batman fan. Um, I'm more likely to do a Wonder Woman reading order, or a Flash reading order, or even an Aquaman reading order. I've got a lot of Batman comics, but it'd be a huge task, much bigger than Superman, to read all the Batman comics and to do a reading order of that. Of course, that reading order again would be from, I guess, around about 1991 up until 2011, but it'd be a huge task. I'm not planning on doing that. But for everyone who sits there and types away and tells me that I need to do one, I'm going to make a deal with you. If the Superman reading order gets some degree of traction, and once it gets 100 five-star reviews, which by the way, I don't think is going to get that many reviews of any star number, but if it does, under some bizarre circumstance, manage to get, let's call it 500 five-star reviews for the Superman reading order, and then what I'll do is I'll do a Batman reading order, and I'll do a series for it, and I'll do maps or I'll do a spreadsheet, and I'll make a written guide available on Amazon for 99 pence. But otherwise, I don't plan to do that. Now, if you're leaving me a comment down below and you haven't watched this video and you're not listening to this part of it, 22 minutes in, then all I'm going to say is you should have watched the video. And now if you're watching the video, having left a comment and had a sarcastic response from me, now you understand why there's a sarcastic response. If you want a Batman reading guide, you're going to have to support the channel by buying the Superman guide and leaving a 5-star review. Once you've got 500 of those, fine, I'll do a Batman reading guide, but that's not going to happen, and I don't expect it to happen. I don't really want it to happen. Um, like I say, Batman, like him, don't love him the way lots of y'all love him, I'll tell you that. So there we have it. That's the introduction video. Um, As I say, if there's any terms here you're unsure of, I'd recommend you watch some of my vocabulary of comics videos, especially the one about type P and J readers, so the continuity one, and potentially the one about terms and definitions. I know these things can be a bit tedious, but it really will help you understand the next few videos. And on that note, tomorrow I'll be looking at Superman First Era, which will be starting off with Man of Steel issue 1 from 1991, and we're going to dive into excruciating detail as we go step by step, issue by issue, through almost 1,700 Superman issues. Thanks for watching, thanks for joining in, and welcome to the ride.